We all know the power of music, the power of song. Judaism has a great understanding of the power of a melody and integrated song and music into its most auspicious services in the temple of old. When they would bring an offering, a communal offering in the Holy Temple, the Levites, the Leviim, would be there singing and also playing instruments. We're actually told that a Levi would have to spend 5 years studying music before he would be admitted into the choir that sang at the time that they offered sacrifices. Now, when did they actually do the singing? When they poured the wine on the altar. You know, in secular society, wine and song are sometimes associated with vice. But in Judaism, wine and song could be the mediums to reach heightened states of spirituality. We know that Nadav and Avihu, the two sons of Aaron, perished when they brought an offering and their souls just left their bodies. And according to one opinion, they had taken wine, and the wine unhinged their soul, that the soul was consumed with passion. Of course, when wine is not required or not recommended, it's not necessarily a positive thing. But wine reveals the secrets, and so does song, so does music. The Alter Rebbe, the founder of the Chabad movement, the author of the Tanya, once said that while speech is the pen of the heart, you express your feelings through speech, music is the pen of the soul, much deeper than just speech. So in this week's Torah portion, we read about the role of the Leviim, the Levites. In chapter 8, verse 16, the Torah states, "For they are dedicated to me from among the children." A more literal rendition reads, "For they are dedicated to me," a repetition of the word dedicated. So Rashi explains that why is there a repetition? He says because the Leviim had two primary functions in the temple. One was to carry the tabernacle, the Mishkan, the portable temple in the desert, and the other one was to sing. And so we know that was considered to be a very important function of the temple. But how important was that function? Here we find a difference between the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud. You know, there are two Talmuds. When the Mishnah was written near the end of the 2nd century, which collected all of the oral teachings of the Torah, the rabbis, which was done in Israel, the rabbis in Israel, as well as the rabbis in Babylonia, started to clarify the Mishnah, to give the reasons for the Mishnah, to clarify obscure teachings there, to apply it to new situations. So that created two different works. One was called the Jerusalem Talmud, although it was not written in Jerusalem per se, it was written in the north of Israel, but we refer to things in Israel as Jerusalem because that's the center of Israel. And that was completed about 100 years before the Babylonian Talmud. So we have two different Talmuds. Very often they overlap, and very often they have different emphases. And here we find this difference with regard to the song that the Levites sang in the sanctuary. In the Jerusalem Talmud, we're told that the role of song was to procure atonement. That how did the people who brought an offering, how did the Jewish people who brought their daily offerings procure atonement for the Jewish people? It was through song. In other words, not just the sacrifice is a form of atonement, but it was the song, the singing that was also part of the atonement process. When we look at the Babylonian Talmud, it seems that song was only an accessory to the sacrifice. The sacrifice is the primary source of atonement. The song embellished the sacrifice, it enhanced it, but the song itself, melody itself, didn't have that power of atonement. So we have to understand, where did the Jerusalem Talmud get the idea that the song itself is what procures atonement? Why does the Babylonian Talmud disagree? But here's another question that will, once we answer this one, it'll answer the others as well. The only time they used to sing in the temple was when they had a communal offering. But when an individual, a private citizen, would bring a sin offering, which was to get atonement for his sin, there would be no singing. Now, if, as the Jerusalem Talmud asserts, the song was a part of the process of atonement, you would think that that process would be reserved specifically for a sin offering. But rather, we find that sin offerings don't carry with it the requirement of song. Why not? So we have to first address that question by explaining that there are really two dimensions of atonement. Actually, many more than two, but two general dimensions. The first thing that happens when a person sins, when a person does something against God's will, which is the same as if you would do something against your fellow. What do you do in order for forgiveness to occur? You have to say, I'm sorry. You have to apologize. You have to say, I'm sorry. You have to really mean that you're sorry. You have to realize that what you did was wrong. You have to own up to it. You have to be brutally honest. You can't try to justify yourself. You can't just engage in some spiritual meditation that will elevate you to a higher level, because you have to deal with the negative in you. You have to put on your gloves. You have to get into the trenches of your personality, of what you did, really understand the gravity of what you did. It's very easy for a person, let's say you hurt someone's feelings terribly, or you hurt them physically, God forbid, in both cases, God forbid, and you really want to atone for it. So what do? You go out into the forest and you meditate and you sing beautiful, inspiring melodies. Is that going to really make a difference? Yes. While you're singing, you're uplifted to a higher dimension. You're in a spiritual realm, far away from the evils of this world. But that's not the world in which you did what was wrong. What you did what was wrong was not in the meditative state, in the spiritual realm. You hurt the other person's feelings. So in order to get atonement, forgiveness, you have to really roll up your sleeves and go to that person, recognize what you did was wrong, do everything that you can do to repair the breaches, repair the damage. And that's what the first level of atonement is all about, getting forgiveness on a very basic level. But the word in Hebrew for atonement is kapara or kapara, which has several meanings. There are different nuances there. One nuance is simply forgiveness. I hurt someone's feelings. I say, I'm sorry. I really apologize. And the person says, I forgive you. You got kapara. You got forgiveness. But that's not the deeper level of kapara. The deeper level takes us to a higher state. After a person goes through a purification process, through doing teshuvah, through repenting, through expressing remorse, through resolving not to do it again, to really owning up to it, really understanding what the damage it is that they caused, and do everything in their power to repair it, they become uplifted to a higher level. They're more refined. They're closer to a more spiritual dimension of existence. Once you come to a higher level, you look at what you did and you realize that there are things and nuances of what you did wrong that you didn't even realize before. When a person does something against God and they say, I'm sorry to God, well, when they reach a higher level of perfection, of refinement, they realize that what they did against God was more than what they realized before, because they see things from a different perspective. And therefore, it demands of them to do tshuva, repentance, on a much higher level. It elicits a much greater requirement, an understanding of a requirement to go to a higher level. And as we keep on going to higher levels, we continue to realize that on the higher level, we haven't done enough. We haven't reached the level where we're completely cleansed. And in that regard, you need some spiritual elevation and uplifting through melody. This explains the difference between the Babylonian and the Jerusalem Talmud. Let's start with the Babylonian Talmud. The Babylonian Talmud was written, as the name itself tells us, in Babylonia. Babylonia is described as a dark place. It was physically dark because it was in a valley. They didn't get too much sunlight. But it was dark because it represented the Golus, the Galut, the exile. The Jewish people were exiled to Babylonia during the time of the first temple, when the first temple was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian monarch. And that threw the Jewish people into a state of darkness. The Babylonian Talmud was a Talmud written for people, primarily for people who had to contend with exile conditions, who had to deal with the darkness. In fact, the Babylonian Talmud applies the verse in Lamentations to itself. The verse there says, "B'machashakim hoshivani," you settled me in the darkness. And the Babylonian Talmud says, that refers to us. We are the Talmud that deals with darkness. We are in the trenches. We have to deal with all sorts of exile conditions. From the perspective of someone who's dealing with exile conditions, someone who is in with the lowest of the low, they can't focus on song and melody as a way of uplifting everyone, because that would be a facade. Once you reach this spiritual level, you're just papering over all the negatives, all the garbage that's underneath. It's like taking your garbage, and instead of dumping it, incinerating it, you just cover it with a beautiful silk cover, even with gold on it. That doesn't really help. Yes, the gold is gold and the silk is silk, but what's underneath it remains there. You have to cleanse yourself through the conventional means of repentance, of tshuva. Once you do that, and music and song enhances that and embellishes that, but it can't be used as an independent source of spiritual elevation, because then you will never get out of the darkness. But let's go now to the Jerusalem Talmud. The Jerusalem Talmud is the Talmud of Israel. Even though it was also written in a time of exile, it was written when the Jewish people were still under the influence of the Second Temple. The Jerusalem Talmud, its style is described as a Talmud of light. Things are much more clear. There are fewer questions and arguments back and forth. There's a statement, there's a question, there's an answer, and you go on to the next subject. Everything is clear. It's the difference. Sometimes the metaphor was given to two people are in a room, in a dark room. One of them is trying to get out, and he's groping in the dark until he finds a window, and he says, no, this is not the exit. Then he finds a closet. No, this couldn't be the exit. And then he finally finds the exit, and he goes out. The person who just takes a match and strikes the match doesn't have to go through all those different steps, to go straight for the exit and leaves without having to be obstructed by all the other things in his way. The Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud, is like the person who strikes the match. There's light, there's clarity. When you're dealing with a Talmud that deals with a person on a higher spiritual level, true, even on the higher spiritual level, you still have to seek atonement. You still have to get closer to God and realize that there are still flaws, there are still cracks, hairline cracks in your personality that you haven't corrected. But because you're a more rarefied being, you're in a higher spiritual level, then music is the ideal way of getting to this elevated state, because we're dealing with a person who's already out of the trenches, out of the lower levels of existence. We are now living in a very interesting time. We are at the very end of exile. As the Rabbi told us, we are the last generation of exile and the first generation of redemption. So we are in a bridge type of situation. Now, when you're on a bridge between two places, you have elements of both. So on one hand, we still have the darkness of exile. On the other hand, the light of the future is already in sight. And therefore, we have both elements. We have partly the Babylonian need to deal with reality the way it is without trying to sugarcoat it with spiritual covers, but we have to really work on ourselves and change our personalities in a very down-to-earth, conventional way, but we're also tasting the light of the future, and therefore music today has a much greater role than it was in the past. It's not only an accessory, while it is that, to the process of change, it's also an independent experience, provided that the music is spiritual music, holy music. And that's why the emphasis should be on singing melodies. Not only should the lyrics come from biblical or Talmudic or Midrashic sources, but the melody itself, we should focus on those melodies that were composed by holy people, by people who were so spiritual, who knew how to unlock the soul within each and every one of us. And this will lead us ultimately to what is described as Shira Chadasha, a new song that will be sung. We're told that there were 10 songs, biblical songs, 9 of which have already been mentioned in the Torah. The 10th one will be sung by the Jewish people with the imminent coming of Mashiach.